Dzień dobry Państwu. Spotykamy się w ramach festiwalu Conrada. Jest to specjalne wydanie pandemiczne. Nie poddajemy się po prostu żadnym wirusom i dalej kontynuujemy nasze rozmowy intelektualne, literackie i interdyscyplinarne. Bardzo się cieszę, że moim gościem jest Kevin Barry, autor, którego od lat obserwuję i czytam. Jest bardzo utytułowanym irlandzkim pisarzem, który wydał 3 powieści i 2 tomy opowiadań. Jedna z tych powieści została wydana po polsku w wydawnictwie Pauza. Nocny prom do Tangeru. To jest ta książka, to jest ta wspaniała powieść. I ukazało się też opowiadanie w ramach Międzynarodowego Festiwalu Opowiadania. Zostało tak zilustrowane. Trochę perwersyjnie, trochę tajemniczo, a może właśnie lirycznie. Ukazało się właśnie po polsku Sezon na Jelenie. No i co? Nie wiem, czy nie powiedzieć paru słów o tej prozie dla Państwa, jeśli Państwo jej nie znają. Kilka rzeczy będzie, jak będziemy rozmawiać, to kilka uwag na temat tej prozy na pewno Państwo usłyszycie. To może zacznę od rozmowy z Tobą, Barry. Będzie to taka rozmowa zapraszająca dla wszystkich. Rok temu byłeś w Polsce, we Wrocławiu, podczas Międzynarodowego Festiwalu Opowiadania czytałeś swoją prozę, przeziębiłeś się wtedy i trochę chowałeś w hotelu, więc cieszę się.
Yeah.
Yes.
I did. Yeah, I did a lot. I did a lot of traveling last year because the novel was published. So I seemed to constantly have a cold for about the last 2 or 3 months of the year. But no, it was actually my first trip to Poland. I had never been before. So it was wonderful to get there, even though I was snotty and coughing and sore throat and all that. But it's been such a strange year since then. It feels like a long time ago now, and it's such a shame that I can't come back to Poland in person this year. Obviously, with all the crazy stuff that's going on. But hopefully soon again, I'll get back to the place without a head cold.
Powiedz nam, Kevin, w jakiej sytuacji się znajdujesz, w jakim jesteś mieście, jak się czujesz, jaka jest właściwie w jakim pejzażu w tej chwili jesteś, co widzisz za oknem, żebyśmy też mogli głębiej wejść w tę rozmowę.
Yeah, I'm in the northwest of Ireland, in a very rural place in the countryside. I'm looking out at quite an unusually sunny Irish evening. We had a crazy storm from the Atlantic last night, so there was no electricity and a lot of wind, a lot of rain, a lot of noise. We get a lot of Atlantic storms here, so it's not unusual. I've been here non-stop for the last 5 months because of the pandemic. Because of lockdown. It's been, I think it's a very different experience in the countryside compared to being in a city. It doesn't look any different outside the window. I'm looking out at a lake and fields and cows and sort of green hills. So it doesn't look any different. When you go to a city, it looks very different from usual, of course, and it's much more dramatic. So in a way, it's quite a soft version of the lockdown here. It hasn't been the worst in Ireland compared to some countries, but it has been, pretty serious in its extent as well. I've managed to not sort of be too distracted from my work. The first couple of weeks, you're kind of looking at the news all the time and you're kind of freaked out and a bit paranoid. But I kind of calmed down and I just I actually started a new project just to kind of distract myself from the whole coronavirus and started writing something. It's interesting to see how it will influence our work as time goes on. Even if we're not writing directly about the virus or the pandemic, I'm sure it will influence the work in oblique ways.
Jak ci się łączy w taki sposób? Tak, wydaje mi się, że w tej chwili wszyscy żyjemy w tych symulakrach, o których pisał Baudrillard. To się będzie automatycznie przenosiło do naszej prozy czy twórczości w ogóle. Myślę, że to takie bardzo silne zapośredniczenie będzie pewnie miało wpływ. Nie wiem, czy na język twoich opowiadań i powieści, czy jakby na ogólną atmosferę chłodu jednak, bo te media nadal nie są to wilgotne media, prawda? To jest chłód, poświata, zapośredniczenie, symulacja.
Yeah, well, I work, I think, as a writer of prose fiction, primarily from the ear. That's my tool as a writer. I think it's work that I think prose fiction is kind of a disappointed musical form. Essentially, I think all other art forms aspire to the condition of music. I often think that if I was able to sing, or if I was able to play piano, I wouldn't have to write stories. But I'm not able to sing, and I'm not able to play piano, so I have to make up my fictions. It's mysterious business, prose fiction, and I believe that every novel you write or every short story has its own inherent melody or tune, and you try to listen to it and find it sentence by sentence as you go along. In this way, my approach to prose fiction is probably quite a poetical approach. It's probably the way a poet would go at it. My own career in poetry ended at 16 years old when I decided there was enough poets in Ireland, and I was going to leave them do their business, and I would write stories instead. But it's yeah, I remember as a very young writer in my 20s, reading an interview with the great American novelist Don DeLillo, and he said something that really struck me. He said, "I don't care about the meaning of a sentence. I only care about what it sounds like." And that struck me as absolutely my approach too. I'm interested in glamorous, lovely, beautiful language and sentences. I want to make reading a story a sensual experience for the reader, and for them to proceed in that way. So I proceed. The story has to proceed on its sound as much as what's literally in the text.
Kevin, powiem ci, że wspaniale, że to powiedziałeś, bo ja oczywiście porównanie z Don DeLillo natychmiast do mnie przyszło, kiedy czytałam twoje rzeczy, mimo tego, że piszecie zupełnie inaczej, to znaczy właśnie jego świat jest taki zapośredniczony i zimny, a twój jest pełen kolorów i ten koloryt się cały czas zmienia. Ale rzeczywiście o to chciałam cię zapytać, bo wiesz, ta forma, którą wybrałeś ty i DeLillo, ona jednak jest ryzykowna. Po pierwsze jest przeznaczona dla wysokiej prozy i uchodzi za ambitną. Po drugie, te zgęstki, które się tam pojawiają i to nasycenie językiem sprawia czasami efekt obcości i czytelnik ten efekt obcości może poczuć. Chciałam zapytać cię, czy pilnujesz tej granicy? W jaki sposób osiągasz balans pomiędzy wartką akcją? Bo czy wiesz, szukasz jakiejś formy, którą się bawisz, typu thriller, a poetyckością nazwijmy to, czy nazwijmy to liryzmem, czy nazwijmy to formalnym zabiegiem, właśnie tą zgęstką językową. Czy nie boisz się, że utracisz tych czytelników, dla których to jest bariera?
Yeah, I think books that everybody loves are generally terrible books. The book that pleases everyone and pleases all readers is generally a very forgettable book that doesn't stick around for very long. I am very interested in bringing elements from genre fiction into my work, and trying to elevate it to some degree. I'm absolutely a reader of genre work. I love to read crime fiction. I grew up reading comic books and graphic novels. Just because of my age, my chronology, I grew up as a teenager in the 1980s and in the 1990s. So I'm as much influenced by television and by film as I am by literary works in some ways. And I think the most significant influences are the ones that go in when you're in your late teens or early 20s. It's the stuff that you're involved with then as a consumer of culture that you never get away from. That becomes the kind of foundational influence. So when I was in my late teens and 20, I was interested in David Lynch films, a lot of American literary novels, listening to records by the Pixies or whatever, and these become foundational influences in your work as you go along. I'm asked quite often about Night Boat to Tangier. Do I consider it to be a crime novel? I think it's a book that has criminals in it, but it's not really a crime novel. It's not a whodunit or it doesn't hang on the classic genre pegs. It doesn't do what books are supposed to do in those terms. But I'm very interested in gangsters as types. And what I try to do always is can we see them in the round? Can we take this kind of gangster type, this thug, this lowlife, this drug dealer, and can we humanize them and portray them in a way that kind of just gets beyond the surface to some degree. Interestingly, maybe my books have a lot of dialogue, a lot of talk that goes on in them. But it's not the first thing I think about when I'm thinking about new characters. So, for example, with Morris and Charlie in Night Boat to Tangier, who are two kind of middle-aged, aging gangsters from Cork City in Ireland, and we find them in the south of Spain as they search for a missing daughter of one of them. They talk a lot, and they're quite funny, and they're quite melancholy, and they're quite fucked up. But actually, before I think of what they sound like, I try to think of how they look, how they physically hold themselves in the world. I'm very often writing about men from working class backgrounds in Ireland, and the physical stance is very interesting. It's quite defensive, quite shoulder forward, quite rooted, tense kind of hold. And in that kind of physical stance or way of holding themselves, there's lots of political history, and there's lots of hundreds of years of religion and class tensions and all of those things. But if you get the way your characters present themselves to the world physically, if you can read the level of affront in them, you can then start to hear them very quickly. So they're they have a kind of a nice kind of arrogance, I think, about them as well. There's this kind of twinkle of kind of menace. But my biggest problem with them is that they wouldn't shut up, and I couldn't sleep while I was writing the book because they would keep talking all night long, and it was a difficult process in this way.
Tak, no właśnie. Mamy dla Ciebie z Piotrem Krasnowolskim niespodziankę. Czy Piotrze, Ty jesteś teraz?
Yes, I am.
Tłumaczem.
Well, we
Tak,
have
no
a
to,
interpreter.
ponieważ wspomniałeś zespół Pixies, to może nas przyłączysz.
This is
Piotrze,
something that
zacznij.
brings us all together.
Nasza trójka lubi ten sam zespół. To jest
Three of us
nasz
like
number
the
one.
same band, and that's probably number one that brings us together.
There was a guy.
I missed the translation here.
An underwater guy who controlled the sea got killed by 10 million tons of sludge from New York and New Jersey. This monkey's gone to heaven.
This monkey's gone to heaven. This monkey's gone to heaven.
Heaven.
Come on,
The
Kevin.
creature in the
I think
sky.
there are actually 240 quotes from the
hole in
Pixies.
the
in the novel. If any reader manages to spot them all, they win a week's holiday in the west of Ireland.
Powieści, to będzie naprawdę dobry.
I was asking about a kind of slang and about ethos of old men, a younger brother of Tom Waits, about your characters in your book. They are very, very romantic. This is a little bit decadence. This is a little bit lyric too, but there's a dirt and a darkness inside them too. So we all know people like that. And I feel that you are building an ethos of this kind of people. And I would like you to tell what does it mean for you, this ethos? What is it?
Yeah, it's strange when I start to write a story or a novel or whatever it's going to be. I never sit down with the idea of gangsters in my head, but very quickly these people show up in the work. I think what's interesting for me about writing about Irish men of this type is that Irish people are generally good talkers. We like to talk a lot. We love the sounds of our own voices, but sometimes we say very little. You know, it can take a long time to realize the real meaning of an Irish conversation. We kind of talk in riddles, and we kind of hide our true meaning and intention in conversation. And if an Irish conversation is like this, going along on the surface, the real meaning is all underneath. The real meaning is all submerged underneath. Mm-hmm. And I think as a writer of fiction, that's a really interesting place to listen to, the kind of subtext of what's going on in this conversation. The further I got in Night Boat to Tangier, I discovered it was something very, very unexpected for me. It's simply a portrait of a family, of quite a strange extended family, where you have two men who are involved with the same woman. There's a girl who we're not even sure about the actual paternity, but it's. I think the Irish character is really tricky to kind of reduce to a few words. There's a kind of a melancholy that can kind of lead into this kind of menacing atmosphere almost. It comes out of some sort of defensiveness. I'm not sure how, but it's with Maurice and Charlie. It's also kind of a love story. You know, they're obsessed with each other above everything else in the book. They kind of. It's like a long marriage of these old gangsters. They could finish each other's sentences and so on. What was some of the most difficult things to do in the book were the kind of the violent episodes. Violence is very hard to write. It's very difficult. It was necessary in this story to bring in violent moments and how do you treat it? I'm very wary of using violence for comic effect, but I do that all the time. Especially in my first published novel, I absolutely used violence for comic effect in the way that it would be used in American TV shows like The Sopranos or like Deadwood or in shows like that. But I sometimes wonder. Am I going to leave all these gangsters behind, or will I continue to try and develop this kind of ethos about Irish gangsters and who they are? But I don't know. I'm drawn to them on the page. Failure is.
No właśnie, bo ty oglądasz Breaking Bad, prawda?
Of course. I don't think it's one of the all-time greats. I don't think it's one of the all-time greats. I like it, but I don't think it's up with the very best shows.
Chciałam zapytać o miejsce akcji. Dlaczego wybrałeś port? Wspomniałeś wcześniej o melancholii Irlandczyków. Tutaj port to chyba także nostalgia. Pojawiło się jedno z pytań od czytelników, ja też chciałabym je zadać. Oczywiście ono dotyczy Tangeru, który jest tak mocno obudowany, jeśli chodzi o konteksty literackie, że no nie jest to niewinne słowo ani niewinne miejsce. W Polsce czytany jest szeroko i Paul Bowles, i Jane Bowles, przetłumaczeni przez świetnych tłumaczy. No i chciałam zapytać o ten Tanger, czy to rzeczywiście było niewinne i o ten port. Co ci daje jako pisarzowi, oprócz plastyczności, to miejsce przechodnie, takie jak dworzec, jak lotnisko, jak hotel?
Yeah, it's I think I was talking a little while ago about the stuff that you're into in your late teens and when you're 20. And I think my first trip to Tangier was around 1990 when I was about 20. And it was very much for kind of William Burroughs related reasons. I was hugely into Burroughs and kind of beatnik kind of literature at that age. You grow out of that a little bit as you get older. But I was obsessed with the fact that he had written The Naked Lunch and so forth in Tangier, and I went with some friends on a trip to there. But afterwards, in the years that came, when I would think about that trip, I didn't think about Tangier at all. I would always think about Algeciras, the port in Spain, where you get the boat from. It was a kind of a gloriously seedy and dangerous place at that time. It's kind of cleaned up a little bit since. They've cleaned up the ferry terminal. When I was writing the novel, I went back to Algeciras and actually wrote some of it in the ferry terminal. In the bar at the ferry terminal, I was making notes, but they've kind of cleaned it up a little bit too much. I was disappointed, but it was. I mean, I think almost everything I write, whether it's a short story or a script or a novel, the initial spark or the initial inspiration is a place. That's always the first thing. I think that I think places give out their own auras and energies and feelings, and it's writers and artists get this sense of a place and want to create something, a piece of work in response to it. And Algeciras wanted a novel from me, and it struck me that it was a perfect stage. It was a perfect stage setting for these two Irish gangsters. I've been going to Spain for a long time. Since the kind of 90s, I go there in the winter a little bit. This was before I published books. I used to work as a freelance journalist, and I would manage if I could. The Irish winter is really awful. It's a terrible, wet, dark, long winter here. So it's nice to be able to escape in January or February. I would go every year for as long as I could afford, for a few weeks or sometimes even for a couple of months, and I would just drift around Andalusia. And I was doing this for 20 years. And then a couple of years ago, I kept saying to myself, I've got all this kind of Spanish texture that I could use, but how do I write a Spain novel? I don't speak Spanish, or how would I do it? And it came to me, I had a blinding flash of inspiration. If I just put two Irishmen in Spain, that's it. I could write it then. And the ferry terminal at Algeciras seemed to me a perfect stage. And actually, the first draft of this story was as a stage play. I thought I could make it work as a play. I work in theatre a little, but very quickly, the story kept moving into the past. It kept moving backwards, and I knew it needed the space of a novel to really kind of humanize these two men.
Mówisz o tym, że każdy pisarz szuka tej energii, tego czegoś specyficznego, specjalnego w danym miejscu, ale wcześniej opowiadałeś też w którymś z wywiadów, że Breaking Bad oglądasz, kiedy jesteś zmęczony, żeby odpocząć, ale powiedziałeś takie zdanie, że wszystko pracuje na książkę, że jakby cały świat pracuje na książkę, everything works on your book. Nawet to oglądanie Breaking Bad, kiedy bierzesz z tego jakiś plot, jakąś akcję, pomyślałam wtedy, że wiesz, że jak bardzo musisz być cały czas otwarty i wyczulony na wszystkie impulsy, żeby cały czas brać. Jak radzisz sobie z niepokojem i jak radzisz sobie z lękiem i z przemęczeniem, przeciążeniem tej wspaniałej głowy, otwartej i po prostu wchłaniającej wszystko? Czy potrafisz się wyłączać i rzeczywiście odpoczywać, czy jesteś w tym cały czas i tyle? Przyjmujesz to po prostu, taka jest część tej pracy.
Yeah, I mean, I think anxiety is one of the main energies that writers write from. We don't write because we're happy and because everything is wonderful. We write because of a very urgent need to put shape and meaning on things that can seem shapeless and meaningless. The older you get and you look at the world and you look at lives around you, everything seems to hover increasingly towards a condition of shapelessness. And it's a very fundamental human urge to try and put narrative shape and meaning on things. I mean, it's a really interesting time to be writing fiction of any form. It's changing in lots of ways. A lot of what we used to get from the novel, we get from TV shows now. Literary prose fiction is becoming more elliptical. It's becoming a little bit more oblique in its approaches. I'm kind of very interested in working in different forms and also stealing and robbing from different forms and taking energies that occur maybe in television drama or in graphic novels and trying to put them into literary fiction. But yeah, I mean, anxiety is a fundamental reason why I work. I think, I mean, when you think about style, your literary style, your style as a prose writer, there's nothing mysterious about it. It's merely a very direct projection of your personality, and there's no hiding from it. It all comes out on the page, and you just have to go with it. After a certain period has elapsed in life, there's nothing much you can do about your personality, and you just have to go with it on the prose. And you can't lie in fiction. You know, when you're making it up on the page, everything comes out in truth, the truth of who you are as a person. And certainly, I'm a kind of a. I mean, what I have, I think, as a writer to bring to the page is I have a lot of kind of hysterical, nervous energy, if I can put it like that. And this gives kind of vivacity, I think, to the prose on a good day when it comes out. But it's I don't know. I use quotations and I can never remember who said them, but I think it was maybe the novelist Iris Murdoch who said once, "Happiness writes white. It doesn't show up on the page. It's not fundamentally of interest to writers. Failure and anxiety and moral failure and all sorts of decline are the really interesting, juicy subjects, I think.
No tak, właśnie. Teraz powinniśmy porozmawiać o tym, jak trudno funkcjonować pisarzowi w społeczności w takim razie, czy nawet w rodzinie, ale zostawmy ten temat z boku, ponieważ opowiedziałeś także o swoim stylu i o tym, że właśnie to jesteś ty. A jedno z pytań od czytelników, mam takie 3 pytania, jedno już padło, dotyczyło Tangeru, a drugie dotyczy formy zapisu, czyli konkretnie rzeczywiście formalnego rozwiązania. To jest rozwiązanie, którego w Polsce się unika. Niektórzy pisarze anglosascy je stosują, a mianowicie nie podkreślamy kolejnych dialogów, to znaczy ty nie podkreślasz, myślnikami. I jeden z czytelników pyta, czy to jest zamierzony efekt, że czasem nie wiemy, kto mówi, a ponieważ tam jest 2 przyjaciół, to pojawia się wrażenie albo przypuszczenie, albo taka ścieżka lektury, że to właściwie są jakieś 2 jaźnie, że to może są właściwie 2 osoby albo 2 jaźnie w tym samym człowieku. Czy zdajesz sobie sprawę, że to tak też może być czytane? Czy to jest w Irlandii popularny zapis, czy wyłącznie osobniczy i niespotykany?
I wouldn't say it's quite unique to me, but no, I sometimes in short stories I will delineate dialogue in a more traditional way and make it clear who's speaking. That approach didn't seem right for Tangeru as a novel, because it's almost like these two men. Yeah, for example, in Dear Season.
Tak,
In Dear, did I use Marx in Dear Season? Yeah.
Tak.
Yeah.
Tak, to jest cudzysłów.
It's more clear.
Dobrze, i teraz trzecie pytanie od czytelnika.
Whereas with Tangeru, it's almost because these are two men who have grown up together, who have been through a lot of the same things together. It's almost as if the conversation is a single song, if I can put it, just to talk again about that kind of melodic approach, or that musical approach to prose fiction. I don't want it to be as hugely difficult for the reader, but I like if the reader has to work a little, and if the reader has to kind of, I think if the reader has to do a little work, it becomes a richer reading experience for her or for him. You feel like you've earned your way into the book. It's I find we're talking a lot about television because we all watch a lot of these great shows and stuff. But there was a very interesting interview with the creator of The Wire TV show in the US, David Simon, who said he structured each season like a 19th century Russian novel, meaning that you had to do an awful lot of work in the early episodes, as you do in the early chapters of one of those old big thick Russian novels. So what happens is it creates an addictive process, and the deeper you go into it, the more you feel like you're part of that world and you buy yourself into it. My hope for Nightboat to Tangier is once the reader is 10 or 20 or 30 pages in, the minute differences between the two men's usage and the way they speak become clear, and they can tell without being shown who's Morris and who's Charlie. Charlie is funnier. I think is one of the ways that I would delineate them. Morris thinks he's funnier, but Charlie is really funnier, and Charlie is more dangerous of the two. Of course, like it should be said, if you have two Irishmen waiting in a story, you can't pretend there isn't a Samuel Beckett kind of shadow somewhere over the work. But funnily enough, I was thinking about a different playwright, much more so as I wrote it. I was thinking a lot about Harold Pinter, especially the Pinter of kind of his 1960s plays like The Caretaker and so forth, The Birthday Party, because Pinter is really great at blending comedy and menace, danger and comedy. It's a really difficult balancing act, but it felt right for this story. So I was reading a lot of old Pinter plays and texts as I worked on the novel.
Właściwie twoja powieść jest bardzo, wiesz, no taka dramaturgiczna. To właściwie jest gotowe na scenę. Tym bardziej ten zapis jeszcze pogłębia to wrażenie. Piszesz także dramaty, prawda?
I do. I've had like 3 plays produced. I like to work in the theatre for purely pragmatic reasons, because it's more sociable than writing novels. You have colleagues and you have friends for a while compared to those 2 years you're in your room writing the novel. So it's a nice break from writing prose fiction. And I have a great sympathy for actors, especially for stage actors, because it's such a difficult job. You don't get paid very much, and it's they do it because they have to do it. It's truly vocational for them. But yeah, I write for film as well, and it's interesting to work in different forms, because working in one form will mysteriously improve you in another form. I think I've learned a lot about writing short stories from writing stage drama. I've learned a lot about how to strip a story down and how much you can take away. How much of those early drafts of a story is scaffolding, and how much of it you can withdraw from the piece and it's still working. So it's nice to mix it up a little and to work in different forms. It's strange, Ireland is a small country with a very, very serious kind of dramatic history and a stage history. So it can make you very self-conscious as a younger writer if you're in your 20s, when you're writing within this vast tradition with these world-class, really great dramatists casting this shadow, and it could be quite scary. So I started writing drama much later, really, not until my mid-30s. And that was just coincidentally, people asked me to adapt some of my stories for the stage, but I immediately felt very at home in that world. It's terrifying. It's really at the first night when you're waiting for the first laugh. It's very difficult. If somebody doesn't like your novel, you're generally not sitting alongside them at the time, but with a play you might be. But you learn a great deal about your work. If I have a regret about my career so far, I'm sorry I didn't write more plays younger, because there's a lot to learn. It's very difficult, but I'm getting a chance to do some of it now, and I'm really, really engaged with it, and I want to do more.
W teatrze jest taka przykrość, powiedziałeś, że chociaż na chwilę masz przyjaciół. To są takie krótkie historie miłosne. Max Frisch o tym pisał, że przez jakiś czas cały ten zespół to są ludzie, którzy właściwie chcą oddać ci serce, a potem kończy się spektakl i wszystko znika. Jakby wszyscy już są gdzie indziej, prawda? To wielkie oddanie i ta ogromna ekstaza przenosi się w jakieś inne miejsce.
It's like a little debt, when the play is over. Everyone gets it. Everybody feels really depressed for a few weeks, but it just makes you hungry to do more, And the better a play has gone, because it is this little family that comes together for a while, and then it suddenly just disappears. But you do create nice bonds with people if it's gone well, and maybe relationships that you can work on more and do more work together in the future. It's a surprise to me, because when I published my first book of stories, my first book was 2007, so it's only 13 years ago. And if you had asked me what I would be doing in 2020, I would have said novels. I'll just be novel. So that's changed an awful lot. And I guess early on, when I started to read my stories at literary festivals and events, it became clear that people liked to hear them, that they worked aloud in the room. So that quite naturally led me into the idea of writing with actors in mind, whether it be for stage or for screen.
A Kevin, nie gubi się niuans, kiedy robisz adaptację, bo proza, zwłaszcza taka proza jak twoja, czyli stojąca tak blisko wiersza, powiedzmy to sobie otwarcie, tam wiesz, tam ta przestrzeń pozwala na takie zaburzenia percepcyjne. Czytelnik może je mieć, ale idzie dalej w historię, a one w teatrze się nie przybijają, prawda? Jakby w teatrze musi być jaśniejsza emocja. Czy nie masz takiego poczucia, że tak jak się gubi coś w tłumaczeniu, tak samo gubi się coś w przekładzie na język teatralny? Jakby, że ta kreska musi być gruba, żeby to się przebiło do widza, który słyszy to raz.
Yeah. In my experience so far, there's nothing as difficult as writing a play, because you're not just telling a story, you're also building a machine. You're building a little machine that has to work and that has to generate emotion in a room. You can get away with a lot writing short stories or novels if your sentences are good enough. If the sentences are of a high standard, you can get away with an awful lot on the page. It's much more naked in a theatre. It's much more stripped down, as you say, and it's much more difficult. But I think I like that sense of being just slightly out of your depth. I think that's a really good place for a writer to be, or for any kind of an artist to be. It's like when you're at the beach and you're swimming along by the shore, and you're a bit nervous, but you go out a bit further, and you're out of your depth, and you can't quite feel the ground under your feet, and it's scary, but it's exhilarating, and that's what it feels like working on plays for me, where I'm not quite sure I know what I'm doing. The most important part is choosing your partners for the dance, is working with the right people. Also, I think my tone is quite difficult for actors in a way, because I essentially consider myself a comedian. Often it's very dark comedy or very black comedy, but it's intended as comedy all the same. And again, it's easier to get away with that on the page if you can bring your high quality sentences to it, whereas to get away with it when it's an actor saying the words is much more difficult, and you need the right actors. But again, the more dangerous it is and the more difficult it is, the more you're hopefully developing and improving as a writer, and getting braver every time.
Tak. Ostatnie pytanie od czytelnika dotyczy liczby 23 w twojej powieści. Czy w ogóle wiesz i zdajesz sobie sprawę, że ta liczba 23 się tam pojawia? I co to jest za znak?
Okay, I noticed that when Nightboat the Tangier came out, I had to do a lot of explaining to millennials and people younger than me about crusties, because they would say, "What are crusties?" And I would say, "Come on, it's like kids with dreadlocks and a dog on a rope, and and so forth." This was a big scene in Ireland in the 1990s, with sort of illegal raves and all this kind of stuff, and sort of camps of these crusties or hippies or whatever you want to call them all over the west of Ireland. And they were very involved with numerology and all sorts of white magic and so forth. And 23 is a very magical number. Apparently, I don't know why exactly, but 23 is a magical number. So 23 shows up in my work quite a lot, along with references to the Pixies and so forth. You just feed all these things into it. But it's it's strange. Even if you write about a period as recent as the 1990s now, it's historical fiction, because the worlds has changed so quickly and so radically since then. We all have that sense if we're of a certain age, and when you look at photographs of you and your friends from the 1990s, you go, God, we thought we were cool, and you see it now, and it's very different. But it's I can't say any more about the number 23.
We are going to the end of our conversation. And I feel that there was a rhythm of our conversation, and the topic of style was very important. And we were talking about the Lilo and about your language and sentences and the beauty of it. And do you know that Flaubert, when he was writing Mrs. Bovary, Flaubert, he said that he's dreaming about the book without any plot. I mean, everything is just a style for him. It's very camp, Do you dream? Can you imagine that kind of book that you're writing?
I think, I think so many young writers and writers, when they're starting off, emerging writers, worry so much about plot and get tied up in knots thinking about their plots. I don't want to forego plot completely. I like a small amount, just enough that the reader wants to keep turning the pages. But for me, my main interest is in the language and it's in the style and where I can bring that. Just the bare minimum of plot, just to bring it along. But yeah, it's again, it's like we said a little while ago. Your style is purely your personality projected, and if you can tune into it, and if you can get a flow going in your work. You're not just making the work, you're learning about yourself as well. And it's very cathartic as a writer, as a person to do this. I write because I have to do it. I'd be fucked without it. I need to write prose fiction. It's all I'm good for, and it's very important in that way. Whether I'll ever get to the glorious dream of a completely plotless novel, I don't know. But we can try. People have said to me before, why don't you just write poems? Why don't you write poetry? And I don't know. It's been so long since I attempted to write poetry. I don't know if it's time to go back, or maybe it is. I don't know. So it's interesting. But yeah, the plotless novel is the great dream. Finnegan's Wake is probably the great plotless novel. Joyce probably wrote the plotless novel. So he did everything already. So he just have to push on and do other things.
Kevin, na koniec naszej rozmowy obróćmy się do naszych półek. Kiedy panowie tłumacze i techniczni jeszcze tam kombinowali, a nie wiem, czy wiesz, Kevin, że techniczny nasz nazywa się Szatan? Techniczny, tak, to prawda? Ma na nazwisko Szatan, tak słyszałam. No to myśmy wtedy rozglądali się po tych półkach i ja powiedziałam, że na pewno mamy te same książki, albo na pewno znajdziemy wspólne książki, to znaczy ty, ja i tłumacze. I wspomniałeś, że pewnie masz gdzieś Barrymana, którego ja gdzieś intuicyjnie kojarzę z twoją prozą. No już wiemy, że chyba masz Lowella, Updike'a i na pewno Delilo. Czy to prawda?
Yeah, but John Barryman. I had a big phase of reading the Dream songs and almost nothing else for about 6 months of my life. I think sometime around the late 1990s, and not realizing at that time that he wrote a lot of that in Ireland, in Dublin, where he spent a kind of a troubled couple of years in the 1960s. In terms of influence, he definitely has that melancholy in his work. But something that's very important to me as a reader is to read poetry on a daily basis. I read poetry every night after I've had my dinner. It's very important for prose writers, and they don't do it, but to keep your ear tuned to the language, I think it's incredibly important to read poetry and to keep it going. And a terrible thing has happened in schools in Ireland is they don't learn poems by heart anymore. They don't learn to recite poetry, without the book, and I think it's very important to do that. So I still try and learn poems and try to recite them. But it's an incredibly important part of my life as a reader is to read poetry. And I always think that poets are the kind of pioneers in writing. They're the ones pushing into new territory first before the prose writers get there. So in lots of ways, poetry is where the action is for me. And I go back to really old stuff all the time. I love mid 20th century American stuff, Bishop and Lowell and all that. I go back and I read John Donne and I read Shakespeare sonnets and all of that. Of course, I read Irish poetry. Can I ask a question about translation? How does the Polish translation feel? Because I think my books, I think translation is always difficult, but I think I'm especially difficult for translators. Sometimes I always ask my translators, is it still funny when you translate it into your language? Because I think humor is the hardest thing to translate, especially kind of dark, black Irish humor. So is it funny in Polish?
Jest bardzo śmieszna, ale ja też, wiesz, nawet wypisałam sobie te rzeczy, które moim zdaniem były zabójcze dla tłumacza, więc zgadzam się, no ale wiesz, no świetna proza musi być trudna dla tłumacza, no. Także tak było i te zbitki bardzo dowcipne, one były trudne, bo czasami to tworzysz takie, wiesz, jakieś hybrydy różnych zwariowanych słów i one, gdzieś te znaczenia tam są migotliwe w tych zdaniach. No a czasami po prostu to jest poezja miejscami, więc oczywiście trzeba zachować jednoznaczność, trzeba zachować dwuznaczność i myślę, że polski tłumacz ją zachował. Książka jest dobrze przetłumaczona.
Yeah.
Kevin, wspaniale
I
się z
give
tobą
my thanks
rozmawiało.
to translators because it's a hard job.
Po prostu twoja puenta na temat poezji i tego, jaki wiersz
Thank
jest
you so
ważny,
much.
jest w ogóle wybitna, więc ja się cieszę, że mogliśmy pogadać. Widziałam cię zakatorzonego na festiwalu we Wrocławiu i mam nadzieję cię zobaczyć z katarem lub bez na festiwalu w Krakowie, może w przyszłym roku albo za 2 lata, już nie na pandemicznym festiwalu. Trzymam kciuki za twoje wszystkie książki i czekam na polskie przekłady, a jak nie, to będę jękliwym angielskim starała się przeczytać je w oryginale. Dziękuję ci, dziękuję państwu. Trzymaj się, Kevin, i do usłyszenia i zobaczenia.
Thanks so much.